The moment my brother stood up and announced that our father's entire estate belonged to him, the room went silent. Not because anyone was shocked, but because everyone seemed to believe him. My aunt nodded approvingly. My cousins smiled. Even the attorney sitting at the end of the conference table looked uncomfortable as my brother described what he planned to do with the money, the house, and the investments. I sat quietly, listening as if none of it involved me. Nobody asked how I felt. Nobody questioned why Dad, a man who had spent years teaching us both about fairness, would suddenly leave everything to only one child. My brother didn't seem interested in those questions either. He was too busy enjoying the attention. Then he looked directly at me and offered a smile that wasn't kind, wasn't sympathetic, and wasn't even pretending to be respectful. It was the smile of someone who believed he had already won. That's when a knock interrupted the meeting. The attorney glanced toward the door. My brother barely looked up. But when the man who entered introduced himself as the bank manager responsible for handling one of my father's private accounts, the entire room changed, and for the first time that day, my brother stopped smiling. I was 28 years old when my father passed away, and despite what some members of my family later claimed, he and I had always been close. Not in the loud, attention-seeking way my brother preferred, but in the quiet way that mattered. Dad was the person who taught me how to think before reacting, how to keep records, and how to pay attention when everyone else was distracted. Growing up, my brother loved being the center of every room. He was charming, confident, and knew exactly how to make people see what he wanted them to see. I was different. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I argued, and rarely fought for attention. After Dad's funeral, that difference suddenly became a problem. Family members who had barely called in years started appearing with opinions about what Dad would have wanted. My brother seemed especially eager to speak for him. Within days, stories began circulating about private conversations nobody else had heard, promises nobody could verify, and decisions Dad supposedly made near the end of his life. Every version somehow led to the same conclusion: my brother was the rightful heir to everything. I never challenged those claims publicly. I simply listened. Because there was one detail about my father's finances that nobody in that room knew existed, and I had a feeling it would matter eventually. The formal estate meeting was scheduled 3 weeks after my father's funeral, and by the time I arrived at the attorney's office, it already felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a family gathering where everyone had quietly agreed on the outcome before any official documents had been opened. My brother Daniel stood near the window speaking confidently to two of our cousins, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. Every few minutes I caught pieces of the conversation, references to renovations he planned to make to Dad's house, investment accounts he intended to manage, and even discussions about selling certain assets that technically hadn't been assigned to anyone yet. What surprised me wasn't his confidence. Daniel had always been confident. What surprised me was how many people seemed willing to accept his version of events without question. As I took my seat, my Aunt Carol immediately leaned toward me and offered a sympathetic smile that felt rehearsed. She told me she hoped I wasn't taking everything too personally, and reminded me that fathers and sons often shared a special bond. The implication was clear. Whatever happened today, I was expected to accept it gracefully. I simply nodded. Across the room, Daniel noticed the exchange and gave me a small smile before returning to his conversation. It wasn't openly cruel, but it carried the unmistakable satisfaction of someone who believed the game was already over. The attorney eventually entered and asked everyone to settle down. Conversations stopped. Chairs scraped across the floor. The atmosphere shifted into something more formal. For a few moments, I thought the meeting would proceed normally. Then Daniel raised his hand before the attorney had even begun. He announced that he appreciated everyone being there, and said he hoped the process would be quick since our father had made his wishes very clear. Several relatives nodded. The attorney looked uncomfortable but continued organizing his paperwork. I watched carefully. Dad had worked with this attorney for years, and I knew he wasn't the type to tolerate interruptions. Yet he said nothing. That alone caught my attention. As the discussion moved forward, family members began sharing memories of Dad. At first the stories were harmless. Then they slowly shifted toward inheritance. My uncle mentioned how proud Dad had been of Daniel's business ambitions. Another relative recalled seeing them together at a family barbecue discussing long-term plans. Each story seemed designed to reinforce the idea that Daniel had been chosen as the natural successor to everything our father owned. Nobody mentioned the countless evenings Dad and I spent reviewing financial records together. Nobody mentioned that I handled many of his appointments during the years after my mother's death. Nobody mentioned the stack of documents I had helped organize only months before he passed away. It was as though an entirely different history was being created in real time, one where Daniel occupied every important chapter and I barely existed. Still, I remained silent. Years earlier, Dad had given me a piece of advice that stayed with me whenever emotions ran high. He used to say that people reveal more when they believe nobody is challenging them. Watching the room that day, I understood exactly what he meant. The more comfortable Daniel became, the more details he volunteered. He spoke about future plans with extraordinary certainty. He described specific financial expectations. He even referenced account balances that should have been impossible for him to know. That detail lingered in my mind. How could he be so certain about numbers that hadn't been disclosed? The attorney finally prepared to begin reading the estate documents. The room quieted again. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man expecting confirmation rather than information. Around him, relatives exchanged knowing looks. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. Something wasn't adding up, and the more confident my brother appeared, the more convinced I became that he believed he had access to information nobody else did. The question was whether that information was real, or whether he was about to discover how little he actually knew. The attorney adjusted his glasses, opened the estate file, and began reading through the formal details of my father's will. At first, everything sounded routine. There were charitable donations, instructions regarding personal belongings, and several smaller financial distributions to extended family members. The room listened politely, though I could tell most people were waiting for the section that mattered. Daniel certainly was. Every few minutes he checked his watch, leaned back in his chair, and exchanged confident glances with relatives who seemed almost as eager as he was. I watched him carefully. The certainty on his face never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger as the meeting continued. It was the expression of someone who believed the future had already been secured. Then the attorney reached the section concerning the house. Dad's home was the family's most visible asset. It carried decades of memories and represented a significant portion of the estate's value. The attorney explained that ownership would transfer to Daniel. A small wave of approval moved through the room. My aunt smiled openly. One cousin whispered, "That makes sense." Daniel nodded as though the announcement merely confirmed what everyone already knew. Then came several investment accounts. Again, Daniel was named as primary beneficiary on accounts that had been established years before. More approving looks followed. My brother's confidence transformed into satisfaction. He wasn't just winning. He was winning publicly. Eventually, he looked across the table at me. "You okay?" he asked. The concern in his voice sounded practiced. "Of course," I replied calmly. He nodded. "I know Dad's decisions may not make sense to everyone." Several relatives immediately looked uncomfortable, but nobody corrected him. I simply folded my hands and said nothing. Inside, however, I was paying attention to something far more important than the will itself. The attorney looked increasingly uneasy. Every time he completed a section, he glanced toward a separate folder sitting beside him. He never opened it, but his eyes kept returning to it. At first I thought I was imagining things. Then I noticed he wasn't the only one acting strangely. His assistant entered the room twice within 20 minutes. Both times she quietly whispered something in his ear. Both times he nodded without explanation. Daniel either didn't notice or didn't care. His attention remained focused on the portions of the estate already being assigned to him. As the reading continued, family members became bolder. My Aunt Carol began discussing potential buyers for certain properties. One cousin suggested investment opportunities. Another joked that Daniel would have to remember the family when he became wealthy. The atmosphere gradually shifted from mourning to celebration. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a victory party. Then Daniel made a mistake. He started talking about a specific account. Not an account that had been mentioned in the will. A different one. Dad's private financial account. The account had never been discussed publicly. The attorney immediately looked up. So that account wasn't included? Daniel asked casually. The room fell silent. The attorney frowned. What account are you referring to? For the first time all afternoon, Daniel hesitated. It lasted only a second. But I noticed. Everyone noticed. Oh, nothing, he said quickly. Dad mentioned something years ago. The explanation sounded weak. The attorney continued staring at him. Interesting, he replied. Then he returned to the documents. But the mood had changed. A crack had appeared in Daniel's confidence. Because I knew exactly which account he was talking about. And I knew something else. Dad had never discussed that account with him. Not once. I knew because I had been present during every major financial meeting Dad attended during the final 4 years of his life. The account existed. But access to information about it was extremely restricted. Very few people even knew it was there. So how had Daniel learned about it? That question stayed with me as the attorney finally announced a short recess before completing the final sections of the estate review. The room erupted into conversation. Daniel immediately became the center of attention again. Relatives congratulated him. Some spoke openly about inheritance amounts they assumed he would receive. Others discussed future plans for family gatherings at the house. Nobody seemed interested in waiting for the meeting to finish. Nobody except the attorney. While everyone else celebrated, I noticed him step into the hallway carrying that separate folder. A few moments later, through the partially open door, I saw him speaking with someone. Not a family member. Not his assistant. A man in a dark suit. The attorney handed him several documents. The man reviewed them carefully before nodding. Then both men looked toward the conference room. Toward Daniel. And for the first time all afternoon, I saw genuine concern on the attorney's face. The recess ended 10 minutes later, and when everyone returned to their seats, the atmosphere felt slightly different, though most of my relatives were too distracted by Daniel's apparent victory to notice. My brother walked back into the conference room carrying himself like the owner of everything he could see. Conversations followed him. Congratulations followed him. Assumptions followed him. The house was supposedly his. The investments were supposedly his. The future had already been written in the minds of everyone around the table. I sat quietly in the same chair I had occupied all afternoon, watching the confidence build around him like a structure being assembled one careless piece at a time. The attorney resumed the meeting, but his attention seemed divided. He kept glancing toward the conference room door as though expecting someone. Daniel noticed none of it. He was too busy discussing renovation plans for Dad's property with our uncle. At one point he even laughed and said he might sell the place entirely because sentimentality wasn't a sound financial strategy. Several relatives chuckled. Hearing those words stung more than I expected. My father had spent 30 years building that home. Every room held memories. Every wall carried a story. Yet Daniel spoke about it as though it were already a line item on a spreadsheet. The attorney finally cleared his throat and attempted to continue reading the remaining estate documents. Before he could finish the first paragraph, a knock sounded at the door. The room went quiet. The attorney immediately stood. Unlike earlier interruptions, this one seemed expected. He walked across the room and opened the door. A man entered carrying a leather portfolio and several sealed folders. He appeared to be in his late 50s, professionally dressed, composed, and completely unaffected by the curiosity filling the room. The attorney welcomed him formally and invited him to sit at the opposite end of the table. Daniel frowned slightly. "Who is this?" he asked. The attorney folded his hands. "Before we conclude today's proceedings, there is an additional matter that requires clarification." Daniel's smile weakened. The man opened his portfolio and introduced himself as the senior bank manager responsible for overseeing several of my father's financial holdings. A murmur spread through the room. Most relatives looked confused. Others appeared annoyed by the delay. Daniel leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I don't understand why a bank manager is here," he said. The man looked directly at him. "Because your father's estate includes assets that do not fall under the documents reviewed so far." Silence followed. Even the relatives who had spent the entire afternoon celebrating suddenly paid attention. The bank manager calmly removed a folder and placed it on the table. "Several years ago, Your father established a private financial structure containing specific instructions regarding ownership, access, and distribution. Daniel immediately sat forward. And those assets belong to the estate? He asked. The eagerness in his voice was impossible to miss. The bank manager didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reviewed several pages before speaking. Not exactly. The room became completely still. My aunt looked confused. One cousin exchanged nervous glances with another. Daniel's expression hardened. What does that mean? He asked. The bank manager opened another document. It means these assets were intentionally separated from the portions of the estate discussed today. Daniel laughed softly, though it sounded forced. Separated for what reason? The manager looked down at the paperwork before responding. Your father provided detailed written instructions explaining his reasoning. At that moment, every person in the room seemed to lean forward. The confidence that had surrounded Daniel all afternoon began to fade. Questions replaced assumptions. Certainty turned into anxiety. Even more telling was the expression on my brother's face. For the first time since the meeting began, he no longer looked like someone celebrating a victory. He looked like someone realizing an important piece of information had been missing from the story he thought he understood. Meanwhile, I remained exactly where I had been all day, quiet, patient, and listening, because I already knew the most important part wasn't the existence of those assets. It was the reason my father had created them, and once that explanation was read aloud, nothing in that room would ever be the same again. The bank manager adjusted the documents in front of him and waited until the room was completely silent before continuing. Nobody interrupted him now. The relatives who had spent the entire afternoon congratulating Daniel sat frozen in their seats, their confidence disappearing with every passing second. My brother stared at the folder as though willing it to contain the outcome he wanted. The attorney nodded for the manager to proceed. Your father established these accounts 6 years ago, the bank manager began. At the same time, he provided written instructions explaining exactly how they were to be handled after his death. He opened the first document and read directly from the page. These assets are separate from my primary estate because I want them distributed according to actions, responsibilities, and trust demonstrated over time, rather than assumptions made after my death. The room grew noticeably uncomfortable. Daniel shifted in his chair. My aunt glanced toward him and then quickly looked away. The manager continued. During the last years of my life, one of my children consistently assisted with appointments, financial reviews, record organization, and personal care matters. These responsibilities were accepted without expectation of reward and often without recognition. I saw several relatives begin connecting pieces they had ignored for years. They remembered who attended appointments. They remembered who handled paperwork. They remembered who showed up when there was no audience. The manager turned another page. Because of this demonstrated reliability, I have directed that the assets contained within these accounts transfer exclusively to my daughter. No one spoke. No one moved. For several seconds the room seemed incapable of processing what had just been said. Daniel's expression collapsed from confidence into disbelief. That can't be right, he said immediately. There has to be some mistake. The manager calmly slid copies of the signed documents across the table. There is no mistake. The attorney reviewed the paperwork and nodded. These instructions are valid and legally enforceable. Daniel grabbed the documents and scanned them rapidly. The color drained from his face. His eyes moved from page to page, searching for something that would change the outcome. There was nothing. Everything had been documented years earlier. Every instruction had been witnessed, verified, and secured through the bank. Then the manager revealed the detail nobody had expected. The accounts contained substantially more value than the assets distributed through the estate. The room erupted into stunned silence. The house Daniel inherited suddenly seemed less significant. The investment accounts everyone had celebrated suddenly looked incomplete. The true financial legacy had never been sitting inside the will they spent all afternoon discussing. It had been protected elsewhere the entire time. My aunt looked genuinely shocked. One cousin lowered his eyes. Another quietly leaned back in his chair, avoiding eye contact altogether. The people who had spent hours treating me like an afterthought suddenly had nothing to say. Daniel stared at me across the table. "You knew about this?" he asked. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I answered honestly. I knew the accounts existed. I didn't know the final contents of the instructions. The bank manager nodded. "That is correct. Your father specifically prohibited disclosure before his passing." Daniel looked defeated. The certainty that had carried him through the entire day was gone. Not because someone outsmarted him at the last minute, but because he had built his confidence on assumptions instead of facts. My father had anticipated exactly what might happen after he was gone. He knew people would make claims. He knew others would draw conclusions. Most importantly, he knew that actions leave evidence. The evidence had been sitting inside that bank for years. As the meeting ended, nobody congratulated Daniel anymore. Nobody discussed his plans. Nobody celebrated. Instead, the room sat with an uncomfortable truth. The child they underestimated, ignored, and quietly dismissed was the one my father had trusted most all along, and the proof had arrived carrying a leather portfolio and a bank manager's title. When the meeting finally ended, people left far more quietly than they had arrived. The confidence, assumptions, and whispered predictions that had filled the room earlier were gone. One by one, relatives gathered their belongings and avoided conversations they suddenly no longer seemed eager to have. A few offered awkward apologies. Others simply left without saying anything at all. Daniel remained seated for several minutes after everyone else began filing out. For the first time in my life, he looked less concerned with what he had lost and more concerned with what he had misunderstood. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated in the dramatic way people often imagine. Mostly I felt grateful. My father had known that reputations could be rewritten after someone is gone, but he also knew that records, actions, and consistency tell their own story. He had trusted evidence to speak when he no longer could, and in the end it did. The inheritance mattered, of course, but the greater gift was discovering that the years I spent showing up when nobody was watching had been seen after all. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with an argument. Sometimes it walks quietly through a door carrying a folder. If you've ever been underestimated, judged too quickly, or forced to let time reveal what you already knew, share your story below. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional drama stories where patience changes everything.